And I want to thank GPF for having me here, everybody who is involved, Alan and David and Jim and Paul, of course, especially because my perspective comes from international work primarily and not domestic work so much. But I was heartened to see over the last week or so that our Congress actually came together around the question of ISIS, and we've seen some bipartisanship in a true way in the first time for a very long time. What disheartens me is it was only because we had identified a common enemy, right?
That's good.
The other. On all other issues, there's no middle ground anymore. The middle ground has been completely ceded within the congressional, legislative, and even broader political civil society dialogue. And I cast back on the question here and I said, what was the challenge of a young America? What was the primary challenge? And there's some debate about this and cynicism about this, but I think the primary challenge was to get away from dictatorial government of some form and get into representative government of some form where people could be heard and make their own decisions. That is to say, not what are the best ideas, but what is the best mechanism to deal with the inevitability of myriad and sometimes contradictory ideas, participatory processes. They always say that the most important election in the United States was not the first, but the second president who assumed power, because that meant that the first president, you see this in a lot of fledgling democracies, had to willingly give up power and in particular control of the military establishment with which he could have held power. So that is what we committed to early on in the establishment of our democracy, which was persuasion being elevated instead of coercion, right? We share ideas, we convince others of our ideas, and we can self-correct, as was said earlier, if those ideas fail. But we do not force ideas upon others. However, if I'm to believe the 20 or 30 emails I get every day from the PACs, from politicians on both sides of the aisle, then our identity is really only built right now around what we despise and who we exclude. I don't think I have seen one title of an email in my inbox in 5 years that says, I hope to build the following. Every single one is urgent, they're gonna destroy us. You know, we gotta stop these guys, look what they're up to now. Over and over and over again. That doesn't inspire me to act. It inspires me to hit unsubscribe on the email list. Now in the post-war period, the Pax Americana period, I'll take this into my frame of reference, which is the international field. Most of the rest of the world looked on the United States and was inspired by those principles. Primarily the fact that we were striving for impartiality of justice. Of course, the systems are flawed. There were failures, but many of these countries abroad, there is no even attempt or hint to have impartial justice. Those who are within the system are treated a certain way, and those who are outside don't have access even to a mechanism that can serve their interests. That's one. The other was representative governance. Again, flawed, imperfect, but the idea that people can be heard, right? There is a voice, and we actually exported that in a lot of our foreign policy. We gave voice to the voiceless as part of our principal mechanism to engage civil society, bring them to the table to be heard. And now, despite what we would wish, frankly, when people see the US flag pulled up or they look at the United States, what they think of are two characteristics, consumerism and militarism. So, and of course they look at our Congress, which was supposedly the emblematic of functional democracy, and I don't have to go on about how non-functional it is. Look at the number of bills that have been passed in the last 8 years, 5 years, 10 years, the amount of money that goes in to move public policy or even politicians, including foreign money now, undeclared massive amounts of foreign money coming into ad campaigns and PACs, etc. And the ridiculously low participation in election processes. People they completely feel disassociated with the idea that government is us. The demonization of collaboration. You can't even go and talk to someone in the other party without your own party running a primary against you to punish you for having a discussion with someone. It's amazing. So the question I have is when we ask what is the role of religious leadership and religious leaders in the public arena. The question is, are we getting caught in that same undercurrent and serving those divisions? Or are we taking on our responsibility to lead from the bottom up, to answer that breakdown by presenting an alternative expression of collaboration? Not just an argument, but action, right? Demonstrate. Now, we heard Reverend Schuler talk about prayer and the importance of prayer. And I would contend that there are two kinds of prayer, and this just reinforces what you were saying at the end of your talk. There's contemplative prayer, in which one seeks guidance and connection with the Spirit and God. And then there's prayer in action, in which one does the work of God, again described differently in different traditions, in the world, right? And so the question is, when you kneel down to pray, do you ask God to punish or injure or divide people? So then why do we do this when we go out and we walk through the world, right? They're both prayer. So how are we manifesting God differently in different spaces of prayer? Important to keep in mind. There's a paradox, fundamental paradox in faith. And this is what I put forward as a space in which to grapple with differences and diversity. The paradox is this: faith means two things. It means to know, capital K, know. I believe this is true. But at the same time, it means to not know, to trust, to be in a space, to be in the cloud of unknowing, and put yourself in the hands of something greater and be guided. How do those two things simultaneously exist? Well, that's the process of spiritual reflection. But it's important to realize, and I use this a lot of times with the religious folks I work with abroad, that if you believe God is greater than you, you're not quite in possession of God's full characteristics and God's mind and God's understanding, then you also have to believe that you might be wrong. You have to believe in humility, like Micah says, to walk humbly with our God, right? And in doing so, not only do you allow yourself forgiveness of yourself in a process, you allow others as well. And you're always available to the fact that as all of God's children, someone who is coming from a very different perspective might have something to share with you and to teach you. I'll give you an example in Colombia. Last month I was in the indigenous communities, the native South American communities, deep in rebel-held territory, up in where the coca fields are and the amapola fields and all this stuff. And we were talking about what's the role of indigenous spirituality in helping Colombia get past the violence and into a post-conflict, a true post-conflict society. And then I came out of that community. I went and had a workshop with a bunch of evangelical pastors. And they responded to my earlier work by saying, oh yeah, we've looked at shamanism and it's the work of Satan. And I mulled on this and scratched my beard and I said, okay, let me ask you a question. I said, God, you feel that God created the world, right? Everyone is God's children. Who are you then to tell God that he cannot be functioning through another individual, another person, another practice, another history? So if someone comes to the table trying to create peace, but they don't have the same book under their arms, who are you to reject them? Because I will tell you, the folks who are trying to foment violence and conflict for their own self-interest, they don't care about your identity. They'll recruit you from wherever you're coming from. And we completely hobble ourselves by creating divisions where there are none. And we see that in politics now. So what's the role of church leadership? Okay, manifest this stuff into the world, right? Manifest this idea that we can connect on values. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Picture the person that you most deeply disagree with, even perhaps despise for their convictions and their policy positions. Unlike what my emails are trying to tell me, I actually don't believe 48% of Americans are trying to destroy America. I really don't. I would be surprised if we found a couple who are actually actively thinking, I'm going to bring this place down, right? Maybe now in the post-ISIS, maybe it was a couple dozen. But so there is something there, even the most fundamental, rudimentary value of, I think I'm doing what's right for this place. I challenged my congressman the other day. I said, don't you ever just consider going down in the secret tunnels there and getting the guy who's all the way on the other side of the aisle and say, come on, let's go sit and have coffee. Don't talk to me about policy positions. Talk to me about why you're here. What do you want for our people? Start there. And unfortunately, his response was, can't talk to those guys, too hard, right? I relate another story. Is it too hard? Too hard. I love this idea of too hard. We were just in Nepal having a conference on protection of religious minorities. The participants were American and Pakistani evangelical megachurch pastors and Deobandi and Wahhabi imams and madrasa leaders. These are the folks who trained the Taliban, right? Of course, now we're not bringing the extremists in at that kind of a level of dialogue. These are folks who have committed to peacemaking and connecting with other faith traditions to do so. But they were sitting together talking about what their spiritual motives were in order to protect religious minorities in the framework of their own national experience. So what that meant was we had to come to the table humble and as equals. What's broken here that we can ask you to help us fix what's broken there so we can collaborate? They put up their doctrinal motives. They had great discussion. We had evangelical pastors saying, I'm not trying to create Chrislam, but this is so important, because where religious legitimacy in a place like the Muslim world trumps everything else, these are the folks that are at the front line of change. So we have got to engage with them, right? And so we're doing an Islamophobia program here with pastors and imams. Some of you might know Majid at the Adams Center, for example. He's intimately involved in this. And with Christians and Muslim leaders in Pakistan to protect Christian religious minorities. Phenomenal. And so when I hear a politician tell me it's too hard, I think, I got a guy who's got shrapnel on his back from in Afghanistan fighting the godless Soviets, who then turned around and fought against us and trained Taliban leaders, sitting there saying, this is the best interfaith conference I've ever been to. And going and mobilizing 20,000 people who follow his word. It's phenomenal. So, in any case, let me just finish up by saying, I take a lot of inspiration. I'm a Quaker. I grew up Catholic. I take a lot of inspiration from John Sobrino, liberation theology. I spent a lot of time in Latin America and still do. And there's a moment in his description of the action of theology in the world where he talks about the crucifixion in terms of what is happening at the moment of the crucifixion of Jesus. Not the resurrection, which we put a lot of energy into, but the crucifixion. That is where man's inhumanity to man is at its most extreme. There is a man, and everybody in that space at that time thought this was a man, a prophet perhaps, but a man. We hadn't gotten to the theology of the Trinity and God and Jesus. A man hanging on a cross because he was preaching universal love. Everyone has access to God. They stabbed him. They nailed him to wood. They humiliated him. Everything they could think of to despise what he represented. Now, in the theology of Christianity, he was able to get down from that cross and smite and destroy everybody if he had felt like it, right? But did not. Allowed the body, the vessel, the individual, even the doctrine to die in order to demonstrate that love was more important. And that's why the impact of the church has been so great. Sobrino challenges us. Find where he is still hanging on the cross. In the world now. Where are people still hung on the cross? The worst that man can do to man. And take them down. That is your Christian challenge. So, perfect timing. Again, I would go back to the principle, the founding principle that persuasion is more effective and important than coercion. We do not want to build our identity around coercion. So let me end because we're at the end. I would say, much like Sobrino interprets the crucifixion, religious leaders need to lead with love as the primary principle, not with smiting as the primary principle. And please help me find those who are hanging on the cross and take them down.